Thank you very much, Jamie, for reading that. I know it's a bit of a long reading. I'm just going to share my screen. It was helpful to hear about all the sorts of different mess that people have. I know there are different ranges of mess. I know some people have had the opportunity during this time to fix up their bookshelves, as we heard from John the other week. Some people, life hasn't changed that much in terms of mess. I did hear of a family the other day who have basically, I think, given up during lockdown. They've allowed their children just to go for it on the walls of their house with texters, and their house is now a living art gallery. Not recommending that necessarily, but life has become very messy for them, and they're in survival mode. So we all live with different sorts of mess at the moment. How can we cope with this mess? How can we find grace in this mess? And we're going to hear a story that for some of you would be very familiar. Some of you will be familiar with the story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. So Jesus is out in the desert area. He's very thirsty. The disciples have gone off looking for food. And he goes to this well. There's a woman at the well, and he asks her for a drink. For some of you, this story is very familiar. And if you've heard it, maybe you've heard the story that this woman is perhaps a bit of a scandalous woman. She's portrayed in various paintings like the ones here. She wears red because red is the colour of naughtiness, or else she's looking very provocative. These are the sorts of stories that we've heard about the Samaritan woman. And it's raised in the text. There are some questions from the text. Why is she alone at the well during the middle of the day? Maybe she's got something to hide. Why is she asking Jesus provocative questions? Maybe she's on the prowl. And why has she had so many husbands? Maybe she's a bit of a loose woman. So these are the sorts of stories you might have heard about the Samaritan woman. But modern scholarship has actually cast aspersions on some of those ideas that we might have had. And I'm going to explore that this morning. And one of the clues as to why this picture of the woman might not be who she really is because at the end of the story, beyond what was read to us, we find out that in response to what she's heard, this woman runs back to her village. And she tells everybody, you've got to come and meet this guy. He's told me everything that's ever happened to me. So she grabs the people and they come with her and they go out and they meet with Jesus and they talk with him. And then later on, he agrees, they persuade him, he agrees to come back to the village. He spends 2 days there and many come to believe. And the villagers actually say to her, they say, we don't believe now just because of your testimony, but we believe because of what Jesus has said. We believe he is the savior of the world. Now, if she really was some sort of scandalous woman, if she was a sort of loose woman, then would they have really listened to her? Would they have taken any notice of her? Would they have all gone out to the desert to see Jesus? And they talk about her testimony. Usually in those days, women's testimony didn't count for much. But here they are listening to her testimony. So I think that maybe we have got that picture of her a little bit wrong. There's still mess, don't worry, there's mess. But maybe it's not the sort of mess we might have imagined. And we'll hear more about that in a moment. So let's start with working through this passage, and we're going to look at this passage in terms of 4 questions, 4 different sorts of mess. We'll look at how does that look like in our own lives, and then we'll see Jesus's response. So let's start off with a bit of context. Right at the beginning of the passage, you realize that there's some hassling that's going on. So there's a bit of a fight that the religious authorities are trying to pick between John the Baptist and Jesus. And Jesus won't have anything to do with that. He decides he's just going to leave. And he decides to go from Judea down the bottom of the map there and to go up towards Galilee. And he goes through Samaria. And what this brings to light is the mess of ostracizing others because of their beliefs. Because Jews usually would not go through Samaria. there was this big conflict between Samaria and the Jews, Samaritans and the Jews, that had gone back hundreds and hundreds of years to the division of Israel into two kingdoms. There was the northern kingdom where Samaria is. There was the southern kingdom where Jerusalem was. And the people in Samaria, they didn't have as much access to the temple in Jerusalem anymore. And it got even worse when the northern kingdom was taken over by the Assyrians and started to intermarry with the Samaritans. That was their conquest strategy, was that they would occupy and they would move into the culture and try and change the culture from within. So the Samaritans continued to worship, but they didn't have access to the sorts of worship opportunities that they would have had before. And in the southern kingdom, they eyed the northern kingdom and the Samaritans with suspicion. They didn't have the pure worship anymore. So there was this suspicion about the Samaritans. And during Jesus's time, the recommendation from the Pharisees was that you did not associate at all with any Samaritan. You avoided them as much as possible. And particularly, they said you should never share a drinking vessel with a Samaritan. Now, we might say, well, that's, pretty crazy, these distinctions. We can understand why the Samaritans worship differently. But do you know that there are over 200 major Protestant denominations in the world? That's just Protestant denominations, over 200. And all those Protestant denominations, they would all read in John 17, where Jesus is praying, and he prays that people would have unity, just as he has unity with the Father, and that all people would be one. And because all his followers would be one, then people would know who Jesus is. We all believe that in all our Protestant denominations, and yet there are all these different denominations. So we can look at the Samaritans and say, wow, this division, this squabble is not very helpful, and yet we have so many different denominations. And how does Jesus respond to that? Well, he goes through Samaria. Yes, it's the quickest way from the north to the south. He was heading towards Galilee. But as I say, most Jews would have avoided that region. Jesus actually goes straight through there. And he encounters Samaritans. He initiates the contact with the Samaritan woman, and he asks her for a drink. He not only talks with her, but he asks her for a drink, which is in direct contravention of what should happen as a Jew. He is making himself ritually unclean by asking her for a drink. Jesus won't have anything to do with these squabbles or ostracizing others. He goes to the people who need to hear. Let's go to our next question. Why does Jesus speak to this woman alone? And look at the mess of gender divisions. You see, at this time, you would rarely, if ever, have a man talking to a woman alone. In fact, when the disciples return with their food, they're quite shocked at what they see. Why is Jesus speaking to this woman? There's a few reasons for that during that time. Some of it was around your reputation. And some of it was because women were considered a bit of an underclass at this time. In fact, there was a prayer that all good Jewish men would pray at this time, which was basically thanking God that they weren't born a Gentile, a woman, or a slave. Into this, Jesus comes and he initiates this connection, this contact with a woman. Now, we might say that those sort of rigid system divisions are not very healthy, and yet look at where we are these days. I don't know if some of you have caught Annabel Crabb's Misrepresented about Australian women parliamentarians, but there they talk about the sexual harassment, they talk about the qualified women who are overlooked for jobs, they talk about men talking over women, they talk about all these things that happen. And we can't say that those sort of gender issues aren't in the church either. If you've listened to the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, episode 5, you would realize that there's all sorts of issues that happen within the church around gender divisions, but not Jesus. Jesus always speaks to women. He speaks to them as equal. He debates with women. Here he has a theological debate with a woman. He spends time with them, he supports them, he heals them, he encourages them, he empowers them, he defends them. Think of the woman caught in adultery and the way that he defends her. He actually really respects women. The first people who saw Jesus alive again after the resurrection were women. Jesus lifts women to a status that was way beyond what they had in that society. And he still is a friend of women today. And more than that, I think what's amazing about this particular story, which, by the way, is the longest conversation recorded in the Bible between Jesus and anyone, it's with a woman and a Samaritan woman, Jesus reveals more to her than he does previously. So in the last chapter, in John chapter 3, he's had a conversation with Nicodemus and he's revealed some stuff about himself there. But here in this chapter, with this conversation, he reveals his true identity, that he is the Messiah, he is the Christ, he is the one that they've been longing to see. He reveals that he is that person to the Samaritan woman. Let's look at our third question. Why does Jesus challenge the woman regarding her relationships? And we'll look at the mess of our messy relationships. Now, this is the part that might be confusing, and I think where a lot of the commentaries in the past have said, well, she must have been a loose woman, because surely she has been. She's had 5 husbands, and right now she's living with a man who isn't her husband. However, modern scholars like Lynn Cohick have pointed out that this was not necessarily extremely rare at the time, and they found similar examples in other documentation of this happening. And part of the reason was that it was very easy for men to get a divorce at this time. A man would just have to go to the priest about his intention to divorce, and he could go through with the divorce. And there's also the fact that people's life expectancies was not very long at this time, that men died young and women died young as well. We don't know the exact circumstances of her, but apparently she's had 5 husbands. So she's either divorced or 5 different husbands have died. And the thing about her living with a man who's not her husband, well, also we know now from modern scholarship that this was a common practice in this time, that you actually were able to live respectfully with a man until either a divorce was finalized or the marriage was approved. So there are reasons why she might have been in this circumstance, and perhaps she deserves our pity rather than our judgment. But we have messy relationships ourselves, don't we? We have in our society divorce, we have family violence, we have families that split and don't talk to each other anymore. And even within our own relationships, we might have issues that come up and arguments, and we might have emotional immaturity, we might have critical spirits. We have these things that happen. And the reality is that relationships are hard. They're really hard work. Into this, we find Jesus offering relationship to us. Jesus is one who will never disappoint us, will never hurt us, will never shame us. He is the one who will always love us, will always be gentle with us, will always be patient with us, will always be kind with us, and he will always persist. And we know that because that's exactly how he deals with this woman. We go now to the last question. What is Jesus offering? And we have a bit of a look at our spiritual mess. So this is part of the critical question that Jesus and the woman spend so much time talking about. She's worried about what's going to happen to her. She knows that the Jews think that the Samaritans are not going to have an eternal future. They don't think that they have the pure worship. And she's concerned about what sort of future she has eternally. Is her worship useless? Is her worship worthless? Because she worships at a mountain, because she doesn't go to the temple, does that change her eternal status? Interestingly, Jesus basically says to her, it's not about what you do at all. He tells her that her responsibility is to receive. He tells her that she is should receive the living water that he is offering to her. He tells her there's going to be a time coming soon, and we know it's after he's died and risen, when people will worship in spirit and truth. It won't be about going to certain places. You can worship anywhere, anytime. God is looking at the heart with which you worship. And then right at the end, he reveals he is the Messiah. He is the one who is coming to bring this new relationship with God to the people. And so Jesus speaks into our spiritual mess too. Sometimes we get caught up. Sometimes we have questions. Am I right with God? Have I sinned just too much? Have I done something wrong? I knew the truth. I knew the right way to act, and I didn't act that way. And Jesus is saying, don't worry about that. Receive grace. He's offering this free gift of grace to us. So let's just see how we can summarize this story. So we might have this mess of the sort of bureaucracy that the religious authorities were setting up, causing rifts between John the Baptist and Jesus. We might have our own bureaucracy causing rifts. We might be caught up in the religious squabbles that we were seeing between the Samaritans and the Jews. And into this sort of mess, Jesus offers peace and truth. We might see the gender divisions that happened, this feeling perhaps of women of not feeling worth. And yet we see that Jesus offers an affirmation of worth. We see these messy relationships, and we might be in them ourselves right now. And we see that Jesus offers us love. And we see the spiritual mess that this woman was facing, not sure of her future, and we might feel that as well. And we see that Jesus offers eternal reconciliation. He actually shows us a picture of what the good life is. The good life is about clarity, is about unity beyond those squabbles and rifts. It's about women and men flourishing in relationship together. It's about having a relationship with God. And it's about purpose now and hope for the future. That is what Jesus is offering us. That is the glimpse of the good life that he's offering. It's the glimpse of that life that he showed to the Samaritan woman that meant that she ran and she got her whole village and she brought them back. And I guess that's the thing, isn't it? When you see this, when you hear this, when you've experienced that grace, it's not something that you want to keep to yourself. It's grace, a gift that you want to offer to others as well. You want to tell others about. And so our hope is that at Harbourside, we become known, I guess, as a sort of well of grace, not just water that slakes our thirst for a little while, but living water. We point people to Jesus, who provides this living water that can truly satisfy forever, where you thirst no more. I want to finish now in a sort of prayer poem. It's a poem that's been written by Jan Richardson, and this is the painting that she did to accompany the poem. So perhaps we can bow our heads and do this as a sort of prayer to God, this poem. It's called The Blessing of the Well. If you stand at the edge of this blessing and call down into it, you will hear your words return to you. If you lean in and listen close, you will hear this blessing give the story of your life back to you. Quiet your voice, quiet your judgment, quiet the way you always tell your story to yourself. Quiet all these and you will hear the whole of it and the hollows of it, the spaces in the telling, the gaps where you hesitate to go. Sit at the rim of this blessing, press your ear to its lip, its sides, its curves that were carved out long ago by those whose thirst drove them deep, those who dug into the layers with only their hands and hope. Rest yourself beside this blessing, and you will begin to hear the sound of water entering the gaps. Still yourself, and you will feel it rising up within you, filling every emptiness, springing forth anew. May the living water of grace that Jesus gives us and offers to us, may we receive it with thanks. Amen.